Hands off the long gun, Doc. Senior Chief Dane Vickers crossed the gravel in 4 strides and lifted the rifle out of the rack she'd been kneeling beside, the way a man takes a toy from a child who hasn't earned it. He held it up so the rest of the team could see. This isn't yours. This is never going to be yours. You want to be useful on my mountain? You carry gauze and a litter? And you stay behind the wire where the grown-ups can find you. A couple of the younger operators laughed, the careful laugh men use when the boss is performing, and they know their job is to be the audience. Cass Holloway didn't laugh. She didn't argue. She set the spotting scope down in the dirt with both hands, slow and level, the way you'd set down something that could still go off. Then she wiped the grit from her palms against her trousers, one and then the other, and looked at the ridge across the valley instead of at him. She was the smallest person on that line by a head. She let him have the rifle. She had learned a long time ago that there's a difference between losing an argument and choosing not to have one. And she already understood the thing the senior chief did not. The mountain didn't care about rank. One day it would ask a question that had only one right answer, and on that day it would not matter who was allowed to shoot. It would only matter who could. Before we go any further, do me a favor. Drop the name of your city in the comments and tell me where you're listening from right now. And then stay with me all the way to the end. Because before this is over, the loudest man on that mountain is going to key a radio and say her name out loud in front of everyone. And you are going to hear exactly what it costs him to do it. Trust me, you want to be there for that. Now let me take you back 3 weeks before any of it. The outpost sat at 9,000 feet on a spine of broken rock the maps just called Fire Base Anchor, a knuckle of sandbags and HESCO barriers wedged between 2 ridge lines, in country so high the air thinned to a knife by noon and froze to 1 by night. You could taste the place before you saw it. Diesel and burned coffee and the cold mineral smell of stone that never fully warmed. The wind came down the valley in the morning at 8 to 12 knots and switched without warning in the afternoon. 2 ridge lines boxed them in. The near one they patrolled, and the far one, the high one, almost 900 meters across the dead air of the valley, where nothing good ever happened. Cass Holloway was the corpsman attached to the SEAL element, holding that rock. To everyone there she was Doc. Small, quiet, useful for blood and bandages and nothing else. What none of them had read in her file, because none of them had bothered, was the line that came before corpsman school. Before the Navy, there had been a man she called Pop, her grandfather, a Marine scout sniper with bad knees and a flat voice who'd raised her on a hardpan range outside Kingman, Arizona, putting a rifle in her hands when she was 9 and teaching her to read wind off the way the cheatgrass leaned. She'd shot competition before she could drive. She'd won things she never told anyone about. And Pop had told her one thing so many times it had worn a groove in her. A rifle's an honest tool, girl. It doesn't care whose hands hold it. You don't keep your edge sharp to show it to people. You keep it sharp for the one day it's the only thing left. She had carried those words across 2 oceans. Nobody on Firebase Anchor knew they were there. The next morning, Vickers found a new way. In the chow tent, loud enough to turn heads, he slid a roll of medical tape down the plywood table toward her like a man tipping a waitress. "There's your weapons system, Doc. Don't let it jam." The new guys grinned into their trays. Cass picked up the tape, put it in her cargo pocket, and kept eating. She was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she said, "Copy that," and nothing else. And the flatness of it was somehow worse than anger. The exclusion was quieter, and it came from higher up. Lieutenant Caleb Mercer was the ground force commander, a decent officer with a fair voice and a blind spot the exact size and shape of his senior chief. When the patrol roster for the Valley Sweeps went up on the plywood board, Holloway's name sat in the same slot every time, rear, inside the wire, on call. Mercer signed it without looking. He'd signed her trauma reports too. The 3 men she'd kept breathing through the last rocket attack, signed them and filed them, and never once connected the steady hands in those reports to the woman he kept benching. He benefited from her in the dark and forgot her in the daylight. That is its own kind of insult. The kind that doesn't even know it's happening. And it wasn't only her. Jonah Pike was the youngest operator on the team, 23, all elbows and enthusiasm. The FNG that Vickers had decided to make into a project. "Pike, did the boat school finally run out of standards, or did they just lose your paperwork?" Pike took it with a tight smile in front of the team and a jaw that worked when he thought no one was looking. He was good. Cass had watched him clear a malfunction faster than men twice his age, but good didn't matter when the loudest man in the room had decided you were a joke. The witness to all of it was a man named Daoud, the local interpreter, gray at the temples, who sat near the makeshift range most afternoons with a glass of tea gone cold. One evening he watched Cass spend 40 minutes at an empty bench. No rifle, just a pencil, and a small green notebook, writing wind calls against ranges. She paced off by eye. He didn't understand it. He thought maybe she was praying or doing sums. "You are very patient, woman," he said in his careful English. "Like you are waiting for someone." She looked up from the notebook. "Something like that," she said. He nodded as if that explained it, and it did not, and he went back to his tea. The bond came on a cold watch, 2 nights later, on the Eastern Guard post, with the stars hammered hard into the black. Pike couldn't get the night optic on the team's spare rifle to hold 0, kept fighting it, swearing under his breath. Cass took it from him without a word, ran her thumb along the mount, found the loose screw he'd missed, snugged it, and handed it back. Then she told him the holds for the far ridge from memory, 850 meters, the way the afternoon wind funneled, the 2 mil drop the cold, thin air would add, rattled them off like a phone number. Pike stared at her. "You ever miss it?" he asked finally. "Shooting. For real." She watched the dark valley for a moment. "I never stopped," she said. "I just stopped letting people watch." And then, only then, the corner of her mouth moved. Not a smile, just the ghost of one, gone before it finished. It was the only time in 3 weeks anyone saw it. Pike grinned like he'd been handed a secret. "If it ever comes down to a shot nobody else on this rock can make," he said, half joking, "you're going to tell me, right?" Cass didn't answer that. She just looked at the high ridge across the valley, the one 900 meters out, and something behind her eyes did math the rest of them couldn't see. It came at 07:10 on a Tuesday, and it came with no warning at all. The morning patrol, Vickers, Pike, Ramey, and 4 others, had pushed 2 kilometers down the valley to clear a culvert. The first burst caught them in the open. Then the whole far ridge lit up. A heavy machine gun opened from the high rocks, a PKM by the deep slamming hammer of it, 7.62 by 54, walking long red tracers down into the riverbed where the patrol had nowhere to go. And underneath that hammer, something worse. The flat single crack of a marksman, patient picking. A Dragunov from the high stones, 800 meters out, run by a man who knew exactly what he was doing. 2 of the patrol went down in the first 30 seconds. The radio in the operations tent broke into a wall of noise and wind and the high, tearing sound of men in the worst minute of their lives. Mercer was on his feet with the handset against his ear, face gone, the color of the sandbags. The team's only designated marksman was already down in that riverbed. Hit, his rifle silent. There was no one left inside the wire who could reach that ridge. No one with the schools. No one with the tab. There was only the cross-valley distance, 840 meters of dead morning air, and the woman standing at the back of the tent with a med bag already on her shoulder. Mercer looked at her. You could see the whole institution fighting it in his face. 3 weeks of a roster he'd signed, a culture he'd allowed, a senior chief he'd trusted. And then you could see all of it lose to the simple, unbearable math of men dying on an open net. Holloway, his voice cracked on her name. Can you make that ridge? 2 words back. Get me Overwatch. She was already moving. What happened on the radio in the next 60 seconds is the part Vickers will carry to his grave. He was pinned behind a boulder the size of a truck, the PKM chewing the rock above his head into white dust, 2 of his men bleeding out within arm's reach, and for the first time in 20 years, he had no answer. He keyed his radio. He didn't say anything. He keyed it again, and there was just his breathing, ragged, the gunfire flat and far through the speaker, and a silence that stretched 3 full seconds, 4, 5, a silence everyone on the net could hear, the sound of a proud man's entire understanding of the world coming apart. When he finally spoke, his voice was not the voice from the firing line. It was small. Anchor, anchor, send me. A breath. Send me the doc. A pause that cost him something visible, even over a radio. Send Holloway to the Eastern Post. Tell her, another breath. The words dragging like something heavy across gravel. Tell her, I need the shot. In the operations tent, the 2 younger operators who'd laughed at the tape 3 weeks ago went absolutely still. Nobody looked at anybody. The man who'd told her she would never touch a rifle on his mountain had just begged for her on an open net, and the whole team had heard him do it. She reached the Eastern Post at a dead run, the highest hardened position on the outpost, the one that looked straight down the throat of the valley to the far ridge. Ramey's spare rifle was racked there, his Mk-11, the 7.62 semi-auto he babied like a firstborn, because Ramey was the one bleeding in the riverbed, and the gun he'd told her to leave behind 100 times was the only one in reach. She dropped behind the parapet, threw the bipod legs out onto the sandbag, and pulled the rifle into her shoulder, and her body did the thing it had not done in front of anyone in years. Her breathing slowed, not from calm, from training so old it lived under the skin. Her cheek found the stock. Her eye found the glass. The valley jumped close. Her first transmission came over the team net in a voice none of them had heard from her. Flat and clean and clinical, every dismissive label she'd carried for 3 weeks burning off it like frost. All stations. Anchor East. I have eyes on the high ridge. Gun team. 2 o'clock high. Big rocks. Marksman left of the gun. Lower, in the cleft. Engaging the gun first. Pike. I need wind. A half second of dead air. Then Pike's voice, ragged, thrilled, scared. Doc, wind's left to right, 8, maybe 10 knots. Gusting. Copy 8. Holding right edge. The rifle settled. The world narrowed to a tube of light and a number. 840 meters. PKM gunner hunched over the weapon, the muzzle strobing, brass arcing off the rock beside him in little gold sparks she could see through the glass. She held a hair into the wind, exhaled half a breath, and let it out the way Pop had taught her on the hardpan 20 years before. The MK-11 cracked, a sharp, splitting, high report that rolled out across the valley and came back off the far stone a full second later. The gunner folded over his weapon and did not move again. The PKM went silent, and the silence was its own sound, a sudden hole in the morning. "Gun down," she said. "Assistant gunner's reaching for it." She shifted 4 inches. Crack. The brass tinkled off the sandbag by her elbow, a small bright sound under the big one. 2. The second man dropped across the first. Down in the riverbed, Vickers felt the hammering stop and lifted his head an inch, and could not believe it. On the ridge, the enemy could not believe it either. They had owned the high ground for 10 minutes, and now their gun was dead, and they did not know from where. They began to swarm, an assault element, 8, 10, 12 fighters breaking from the rocks and pouring down the ridge toward the pinned patrol. AKs hammering, the lighter, faster crack of 7.62 by 39 layered now over everything. Cass began to work. She did not rush. Rushing is how you miss. She took the lead runner at 600 meters, crack, 3, swung to the next, led him a body width down the slope, 4, and the rifle's action cycled hot and smooth against her cheek, the smell of burnt powder thick in the cold air. 5, 6. The men in the riverbed felt the slope above them coming apart and didn't understand why until they realized the fire was coming from behind them, from the outpost, from the eastern post, from the dock. Pike was screaming, spotting corrections through the net and laughing at the same time, a sound halfway between a war cry and a sob. 7, 8, 9. In a little under 3 minutes, she had stacked 9 men on a slope where seconds before her teammates had been dying, and the assault broke and went to ground. Then the morning tried to kill her. It came as a change in the air she felt before she heard it. A low, fast vibration in the rock under her chest, and then a tearing rush overhead that ended in white fire and noise to her right. An RPG. They had found her. The round struck the sandbag wall 4 feet from her shoulder, and the world turned to grit and pressure and a high, pure ringing that swallowed everything else. The blast lifted her off the parapet and threw her against the back of the position, and for a moment there was no up, no down, no sound, only the ring and the taste of copper and dust packed against her teeth. Stone fragments had opened her left forearm from wrist to elbow, a hot, wet line she felt as heat before she felt as pain. Her vision swam and doubled. 40 meters down the slope, the man who'd fired was already up and running for better cover, and behind him 2 more were sprinting to flank the eastern post, to get an angle on the position that had just gutted their assault, and she could see all of it through one good eye in a world that was still spinning. She had maybe 4 seconds. She rolled onto her belly, dragged the bleeding arm under her, jammed the rifle back over the cracked sandbag, and the foregrip was slick with her own blood now, warm against her palm. The flanker on the left was 40 meters out and closing. She did not have time to be afraid. She put the dot on his chest and pressed. Crack. 10. The second flanker dove behind a rock, and she put 2 rounds through the edge of it to keep him there and got her breath back. 11. On the move now. Her ears were still screaming. The arm had gone from heat to a deep, grinding ache. She tied the medical tape. The tape Vickers had slid down the table to mock her, around the worst of the wound, one-handed with her teeth, and never took her eye off the ridge. Anchor east, status Status. Mercer's voice, cracking. She didn't answer. There was no time to answer. She was counting rounds now. The MK-11 ran 20 to a magazine, and she'd loaded 2. She did the math without thinking. The flanker behind the rock broke for it, and she dropped him at 60 meters at 12, and the bolt locked back on an empty magazine with a flat metallic clack that in that silence was the loudest sound in the world. Empty. She rolled to her side, slapped the second mag in, thumbed the bolt release, and the rifle was live again. But now she had 20 rounds, and she could count at least 14 fighters still moving on that slope. And somewhere in the high rocks, the marksman, the patient one, the professional, the Dragunov, had gone quiet, which was so much worse than gunfire. A silent marksman is a marksman who's found you and is taking his time. Here is where Pike changed everything, on his own, with no one telling him to. From the riverbed, pinned with the others, he understood what Cass could not see from her angle, that the assault had a second piece, a heavy gun team trying to reset on a lower shelf of the ridge, dead in her blind spot behind a fold of rock. He didn't call it in. There wasn't time. He low-crawled 40 meters under fire to the patrol's downed saw gunner, dragged the weapon and 2 drums out from under the dead man's arm, and opened up on that shelf himself, walking a long belt of automatic fire across it, the saw's high-ripping snarl, utterly different from the deep slam of the PKM, suppressing the gun team so they couldn't set, buying her the one thing she needed, time and a clear lane. "Doc!" he screamed. "Marksman, you're 11 o'clock. The notch in the high rocks. Muzzle smoke. I saw smoke." She swung left, and there he was, 840 meters, in the notch, prone behind his own rifle, a smudge of a man in the high stones who had killed 2 of her teammates this morning and was lining up a third shot at the riverbed at this exact moment. The hardest thing she would do all day. The wind had switched, afternoon early, gusting now, 12, 14 knots, quartering, the cheat grass on the near slope flattening and springing back in waves. She read like a sentence. Her left arm was shredded and shaking, robbing her of the support she'd trained her whole life to use. The light was flattening, the contrast going. The MK-11's effective limit was right here, at the ragged edge of what the cartridge could even do at this range in this air. And she had, by her count, 11 rounds left. This was the shot. The one Pop had spent 20 years on a hardpan range, getting her ready for without either of them knowing the day or the place. She did not think about the arm. She let it shake and built the position around the shake, sandbag under the handguard, her body a tripod of bone and will. She watched the grass. She watched the smoke off the notch drift and tell her the truth about the wind that the valley floor was lying about. The marksman's barrel shifted a half degree, settling on a target in the riverbed. On Vickers, she would learn later, on the senior chief's exposed shoulder. And she had one breath to take him before he took the man who'd humiliated her. There was no choice in it. There had never been a choice in it. "You don't keep your edge to show people," Pop said, plain and flat in her head, closer than the gunfire. "You keep it for the one day. It's the only thing left." She held 2.5 mils up and a full mil of wind into the gust, and waited for the grass to tell her the gust was peaking. Waited through one heartbeat, 2, the marksman's finger tightening 840 meters away. And on the bottom of her own exhale, in the half second the wind laid flat, she pressed the trigger straight back. The crack rolled out across the valley. The bullet flew for a second and a quarter through the cold, thin air, And in the notch, in the high rocks, the smudge of a man came up off his rifle and lay still. 13 by the gun. The most dangerous man on the mountain, gone. At a distance most shooters on earth would call a prayer. After that, the fight came apart fast. The fighters who'd watched their gun team, their assault, and their marksmen die to fire they could not locate did what unled men do. They broke. She caught 3 more on the open slope. As they ran, 14, 15, 16, and Pike's saw took its toll on the shelf, and by the time the QRF rolled out of the wire and the gunships checked on station, the slope was quiet. The final count from the eastern post, confirmed later by the drone footage, was 24. 24 in a little under 9 minutes. By one corpsman they'd told to stay behind the wire, with a borrowed rifle and a torn-open arm. She keyed the net one last time, and her voice was as flat as the first transmission. No triumph in it, nothing in it at all but the work. Anchor, anchor east. Ridge is clear, no movement. I'm black on ammo, and I'm coming down to the casualties. Then she let go of the rifle, and her hands, which had not shaken once on the trigger, began to shake now. Because the work wasn't done. The shooting was the easy part. The shooting was just numbers. Now she had to go save the man who'd told her to run. She came down off the post and into the riverbed at a controlled sprint, med bag swinging, the bleeding arm forgotten, and she found Theo Ramey, where he'd dragged himself behind a low shelf of rock with one hand pressed to his own chest and the other still gripping the rifle she'd just emptied. The rifle he'd handed her an hour earlier when the first burst tore through them, when he'd looked up at her with the blood already coming and said, "Get back to the wire, Doc. That's an order. Run." And she had taken the rifle out of his hand instead and run the wrong way, up to the post, toward the guns. Now she dropped to her knees beside him in the cold gravel. He was gray. Wet sucking sound on every breath. A through and through to the right chest, tension building, the lung collapsing. Ramey was 29 years old. In the band of his helmet, soft and creased from being looked at too many times, was a black and white ultrasound photo. His wife was due in April. They hadn't picked a name yet. They'd been fighting about it, happily, for 2 months. He grabbed her wrist with a hand gone weak. "Doc," he whispered, and the cocky operator was gone, and underneath was just a scared kid from somewhere with a baby coming. "Doc, am I going to meet her? Tell me straight. Am I going to meet my girl?" Cass had her shears out, was cutting his kid away, her hands moving with a tenderness the rifle had never seen, finding the wound, sealing it, prepping the needle. She did not look up from his chest. She did not slow her hands. When she answered him, her voice had dropped all the way down into something certain and low, a voice with no doubt left in it anywhere, and she gave him the only words that mattered. "You're going to teach her to shoot." She found the second rib space, mid-clavicular, and pushed the needle in, and the chest hissed and gave, and the gray began to lift off his face like fog burning back. "You're going to teach her to read the wind," she said, packing the wound, securing the seal. "And you're going to bore her to death telling her about today. And she is going to roll her eyes at you, and you are going to be there for every second of it. That's not a maybe, Ramey. That's an order. Now breathe." He breathed. It went in clean. His eyes found hers and filled. "Okay," he said. "Okay, Doc." She got the line in, got the fluids running, got the QRF medics on him, and she stayed kneeling in his blood, with her own arm dripping into the gravel, until they lifted him onto the litter, and only then did she let someone look at her. The bird took him out at 7:38. He was on a surgical table 40 minutes later. He kept the promise. He met his girl in April. He named her after no one, because his wife won that fight, and he tells her about the morning on the mountain. So often the kid can recite it. It was 3 weeks before the team was back at Firebase Anchor, long enough for the next part, and it happened on the same firing line where it began. Same gravel, same rack of rifles, same thin, cold air. The team was strung out along the line on a routine 0 day, and Senior Chief Dane Vickers walked the length of it the way he always had. Except he didn't, not anymore, because the walk was different now, slower, the shoulders not as wide. He stopped in front of Cass, who was kneeling at the long-range lane with the spotting scope, and the whole line went quiet on its own, the way a room goes quiet when it knows. Vickers opened his mouth, and nothing came out. He, who had never once been short of words on this line, stood there with his jaw working and his hands opening and closing at his sides. When he finally spoke, his voice came out wrong, sanded down to nothing. "I took that rifle out of your hands." He stopped, started again. "Right here, in front of everybody. I said it would never be yours." His throat moved. "I have been doing this 22 years, and I have never been more wrong about a single—" The word broke in half, and he had to stand there and wait for it to come back, in front of every man who'd watched him be a god on this gravel. It wasn't a joke. I told myself it was a joke. It wasn't. It was me deciding who you were, so I'd never have to find out. And the rest of these men learned it was okay to do that, because they learned it from me, watching me on this line. He looked at her, and his eyes were wet, and he did not wipe them. And that, more than anything, was the measure of how far the man had fallen from the firing line he used to own. I'm not asking you to square it. You don't owe me that. I just needed every one of them to hear me say it where they heard the other thing. He stopped. The wind moved across the line. Cass was quiet for exactly 5 seconds. Then she stood, and she looked at him, and she did not give him absolution, and she did not give him cruelty. She gave him the only true thing there was. "Ramey's alive," she said. 2 words, and the way she said them put the whole morning in its proper place. Not about him, not about her, not about any of it, except the man breathing in a hospital with a daughter coming. She picked up her scope and walked down the line, and Vickers stood where he was for a long time after she'd gone. Mercer came to her separately, 2 days later, alone, in the operations tent at the end of a long evening. This was its own moment, and he made sure of it. He had her trauma reports in his hand, the 3 men from the rocket attack, and now Ramey, and he set them down on the plywood table very carefully, squaring the edges, buying himself a second. Then he did something a lieutenant almost never does in front of the people he commands. He pulled out the folding chair on her side of the table and sat down in it, so that he was sitting and she was standing, so that for once in his life his rank was the smaller thing in the room. He looked at the reports and not at her while he gathered it. "I signed every one of these," he said quietly. "Your name, over and over. And I signed a patrol roster that kept putting you in the back, over and over. I never once held those 2 stacks of paper in the same hand. I let a culture run on my outpost that I'd never have allowed if I'd been honest about what I was looking at." He turned the reports so they faced her. "That's mine, not the senior chief's. Mine. I'm the commander. The silence was permission, and the permission was mine. Then he stood, and he was a lieutenant again, and he looked her dead in the eye, soldier to soldier, and gave her 5 words. You held the high ground. He let it land, both meanings, the rock and the rest of it. And then he did the thing that made it real, because words are just words until something changes behind them. He told her he'd already pushed the paperwork. She was being pulled for the long-range marksmanship instructor billet at the schoolhouse. And Pike, Petty Officer Pike by name, he said, who left cover under fire on his own initiative and changed the outcome of that fight, was going up for a Bronze Star with V. Effective immediately, Mercer said. You're not the back of any roster on my mountain. It wasn't a speech. It was an order with her future in it. That's the only kind of recognition that ever counted. The change in Vickers turned out to be the kind you could touch. A new corpsman rotated in a month later, a replacement, and at the chow tent one evening a visiting senior chief from another element made the old easy joke, nodded at the new doc and said something about how at least this one could carry a litter and look pretty doing it. The table chuckled, the way tables do, and Dane Vickers put down his fork. The whole tent felt it. He stood up, slow, and he walked around to where the visiting chief sat, and he leaned down and said something quiet that nobody else could fully hear, except the 4 words that came at the end, low and flat, and absolutely without humor. Not on this mountain. The visiting chief started to laugh, and then looked at Vickers's face and stopped. Then Vickers did the thing that said it all. He picked up his tray and carried it to the far end of the table to where Cass was sitting alone with her notebook, and he set it down across from her and asked, in a voice the old Vickers would never have used, if the seat was taken. She looked at him for a moment. Then she moved her notebook over to make room. He sat down beside the woman he'd once humiliated on the firing line, in front of everyone, on purpose, where he had once stood against her. And he ate his dinner there, and he did it again the next night, and the night after that, until it wasn't a statement anymore. Until it was just where he sat. Daoud found her at the range on her last afternoon, before the bird that would take her down off the mountain for good. He had his cold tea. He sat down near the bench where he'd watched her 3 weeks before with her pencil and her green notebook, and he looked at her for a while in the flat gold light. I think about that day many times, he said finally, in his careful English. And I want to tell you the thing I understand now that I did not understand then. She waited. When I watched you here, he said, gesturing at the empty bench, with your little book, writing your numbers, no rifle, only writing. I thought this woman is praying, or this woman is bored. I did not understand. He shook his head slowly. You were not praying. You were not bored. You were not waiting for someone. He tapped the bench. You were getting ready for a thing you hoped would never come. And when it came, you were the only one ready. He nodded, satisfied, the way an old man nods when he's finally fit the last piece into place. That is all it was. The rest of us were surprised. You were the only one who was not. It was the simplest true thing anyone said about the whole morning, and it came from the man who'd understood it least, and that was exactly right. That night, Pike couldn't hold it any more. He found her on the eastern post, the same parapet, and he was shaking and talking too fast, all the things that hadn't hit him during the fight hitting him now in the dark. The men he'd dragged, the saw, the dead marksman, the sound Ramey's chest had made. He talked and talked, the way the expressive ones do, The way that lets the rest of us feel what we can't say. Cass didn't tell him to calm down. She didn't tell him it was okay. She just came and stood beside him at the parapet, close, her shoulder almost touching his. And she stayed there in the cold while he got it all out, and her quiet was a kind of hand on his back. When he finally ran down, he wiped his face and laughed, embarrassed. "You don't say much, you know that?" "I know," she said. He looked out at the dark ridge, the high one, 840 meters across the black. "How'd you do it, Doc? Honest, that last shot, with your arm like that, the light going, the wind. How?" Cass was quiet for a while. Then she gave him the thing Pop had given her, the only answer there was. "You don't carry it to be the best on the range," she said. "Anybody can be good when it's easy, and people are watching." She watched the ridge. "You carry it for the one morning. It's the only thing standing between somebody and the dark. That's the whole reason. That's the only reason." Pike nodded slowly, like he'd been handed something he'd spend the rest of his life trying to live up to. Then, deadpan, staring out at the valley, "Okay, new rule. Doc picks the music in the truck." Cass let the ghost of the smile come and go. "Copy that," she said. She left at first light. She climbed into the Bird with her kit over one shoulder and the green notebook in her cargo pocket and the medical tape, the same roll still riding in the other, and she didn't look back at the fire base the way men in movies look back at things. She just looked forward, down the valley, toward the schoolhouse, and the next batch of shooters she'd teach to read The Wind Off the Cheatgrass. Vickers was on the LZ. He hadn't said he'd be there, and he didn't say much now. As the rotors came up and the dust began to lift, he came to a kind of attention. She'd never seen him offer anyone. Not the parade kind, something older and quieter. And he held it as the Bird lifted off the rock. She met his eyes through the open door for 1 second. He gave her a small nod. She gave him one back. And that was the whole distance traveled, 3 weeks of it, said in 2 nods and no words at all. The mountain dropped away beneath her, the broken spine of rock, the 2 ridgelines, the far high notch where a patient man had waited and lost. She felt the cold air come through the door, and she closed her eyes for a second, and there was no triumph in her, none, just a settling. The quiet of a thing confirmed that she had known about herself for a long time. She had been exactly who she was when it was the only thing that mattered. Pop had been right about the rifle, about all of it. It's an honest tool. It doesn't care whose hands hold it. It only ever asked her one question, the same one the mountain asked, the same one the whole world had been asking in its loud, dismissive way for 3 weeks. And on the morning it finally asked it out loud, with men dying in a riverbed and a baby waiting in April, she had answered it the only way she ever could. Not with her voice, not with an argument, with the one thing that had been true the whole time, sitting quiet under everything, waiting. She could.